Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Stevenson Trust for Citizenship lecture at the University of Glasgow. I'm Christopher Carman. I'm the Stevenson Lecture Professor of Citizenship here at the university. The Stevenson Trust for Citizenship was established in 1921 with a generous gift to the university from Sir Daniel Stevenson. Sir Daniel Stevenson was a Glasgow businessman, a philanthropist, and served as Lord Provost and then Chancellor of this university. Following the Great War, Sir Daniel was particularly interested in building international cohesion. And as part of his efforts, he gifted the university with several endowments to promote both the study of citizenship and the study of languages. Part of the remit of the Citizenship Trust is to provide for the education of the people of Glasgow on matters of citizenship, whether at the local, national, or international level. So our public lecture series is part of the way that we try to fulfill Sir Daniel's instructions to us. And so it is a great pleasure to be able to introduce tonight's Stevenson Trust for Citizenship lecture, though I imagine that our speaker probably doesn't require much of an introduction in this hall. Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli is, of course, not just an eminent economist, but he's also principal of the University of Glasgow. He assumed this role in 2009 after having begun his association with the university in 1980, when he began studying for his undergraduate degree in political economy. In the intervening period, he completed his PhD here, went on to a lectureship, went on to a senior lectureship, went on eventually to holding the Daniel Jack Professor of Political Economy chair. He has served as the head of Department of Economics, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Vice Principal of this university, and after a brief flirtation with a university over in the East, assumed the role of Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of Glasgow. All that said, Professor Muscatelli is speaking tonight more as a leading economist than as a university leader. Sir Anton is widely published and has managed the Herculean task of maintaining his research career whilst contributing to the university sector. His research expertise includes monetary economics and central bank independence, macroeconomics, and applied econometrics. Sir Anton's interest in political economy continues to this day, with a recent publication examining the relationships between constitutional norms, electoral processes, economic policies, and economic performance. He has served as an expert advisor to more public bodies than I can list. He has been a consultant to the World Bank, to the European Commission, and has served on the Council of Economic Advisors for the First Minister of Scotland. And as this is Sir Anton's final lecture for the Stevenson Trust as principal of this university, I would finally like to acknowledge and thank Sir Anton for his continued support of the Stevenson Trust over the years, which extend back to 1990 when he helped organize Stevenson events in the Department of Economics. So before I turn the podium over to Sir Anton, I will note that we are recording tonight's lecture and we will make it available on our website as soon as we are able. You can find that by Googling Stevenson Trust, University of Glasgow. So with that, can we welcome Sir Anton Muscatelli?
Well, thank you, Chris, for that very kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be back to give a Stevenson lecture. As you said, I've been involved with the Stevenson Trust for a number of years when I was an academic in Glasgow. I think the last time I had the great pleasure of giving a Stevenson lecture was actually in this hall, was in 2017, and that lecture was, of course, about Brexit and what seemed at that stage to be the potential for a very hard or cliff-edge Brexit. So wind forward 8 years, it's a pleasure to be back with colleagues in this hall. And this time the threat to the international economy is coming from a very different direction. The US presidential election is dramatically changing the international relations landscape. Of course, I'm very conscious that economics is only playing a small part to the overall international relations picture here. President Trump's intervention in the Russia-Ukraine war and other areas of conflict like Gaza, Israel, and the prospect of great instability in the world international order probably worries us rather more on a daily basis than what the US is doing in terms of trade policy and what he will do to our standards of living. Nevertheless, as we see from these headlines, US trade policies will impact on the UK and world economy. And at a time when we are faced with difficult domestic economic choices, what happens to the international trade and the international order does actually matter. Current announcements around trade policy by the US also threaten, really, I think, the basis of rule-based international order, which has governed international economic relations since 1945. See if I can make this. No, I'll probably see if I can make this work easier by shifting this closer. For those of you who are not familiar with the international economic order, you'll be very familiar, of course, with. Thanks very much. You'll be very familiar with other international institutions post-war, but the international economic order was, of course, built on the back of the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, including the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. These were set up at a meeting of 43 countries in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the US in July 1944. The institutions were part of the plan to help rebuild the world economy from the devastation of the Second World War and to promote international economic cooperation. It was followed in 1947 by the establishment of the so-called General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which was a multilateral and provisional agreement which was designed to regulate and promote international trade by reducing or eliminating trade barriers such as tariffs or quotas. And this became the precursor of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, that most of us are familiar with, which was created in 1995. And the Bretton Woods agreements were, of course, driven by the Allied countries, and particularly the US and the UK. And the three key protagonists were US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, his chief economic advisor, Harry Dexter White, and British economist John Maynard Keynes, whom you probably will have heard of. The plan was to build an international post-war economic order based on consensual decision-making and cooperation in terms of both trade and the global financial framework to avoid a return to the economic strife of the interwar years. And it's quite heavy in text, but it's the opening speech. It's an extract of the opening speech by Henry Morgenthau at the Bretton Woods Conference. And I'm not going to read it all, but you can see some of the key points and the highlighted points where he focuses attention on two elementary economic axioms. The first is that prosperity has no fixed limits. It's not a finite substance to be diminished by division. And the second is a corollary of the first, that prosperity, like peace, is indivisible. And I think it's really interesting to look at these two axioms because they are the key beliefs of the post-war Allied leaders, that our national interests are best served in a world of mutual cooperation. And these two axioms, which Morgenthau refers to, are also a great example of the opposite of what is currently described as zero-sum thinking, the notion that one person or one country can only prosper at the expense of the other. It was an attempt to get us away from that. Although increasing protectionism, as we shall see, has been a feature of both the Trump and indeed the Biden presidencies, the rhetoric of America First with Trump 2.0, as you can see, sits completely at odds with this philosophy of a drive towards greater free trade. So anyway, let me tell you what I'm going to try and do tonight. It's basically cover a number of points. Trump 2.0 is coming on the back of a rather two large economic shocks, the pandemic and the subsequent inflation shock. And in fact, even before that, in 2007-8, we had a big shock in the great financial crisis. I want to see what we can learn from Trump 1.0, the period of 2016 to 2020, when we did have a drive towards protectionism. I want to talk about how adaptable the world economy is to what seems to be what some people have called a process of geoeconomic fragmentation and what the dangers are of that. And even if that's not the way we end up, what might be the impact of the Trump 2.0 tariff play and other policies at a global level. And I want a brief glance at our particular economic challenges here in the UK and Europe and how we might actually respond to this challenge that we have. Now, I can't cover everything in this lecture. I could be criticized for not, for instance, covering other important challenges in the global economy and how they interplay with these. Climate crisis, for example, and the fact that Mr. Trump seems to be shifting the US well away from trying to address any of those important targets. I would simply say that covering a lot of these things would probably take more than one lecture. So I'm going to focus unashamedly on trade in this particular lecture. I want to put this up because it's, although it refers to the UK economy, I just want you to get a feel for just how important the shocks are that we suffered in the last 2 decades since the Great Financial Crisis. The Great Financial Crisis essentially shifted us to a much lower growth path. So this is growth in the UK. This is real GDP from 1960 to this day and projecting it forward to 2028. This comes from the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies Green Budget. And as you can see, basically in 2007-8, we had a big slump globally. That put the UK on a slower growth path, that red path as opposed to that blue path. And then, of course, we had COVID, which really created massive economic damage. And we've only just recovered in level terms to where we were before. But we are now proceeding at an even slower growth rate since then. So essentially, we've suffered a number of shocks. So this is coming on top of what has already been a pretty dramatic period in terms of the global economy. Now, I've only put up the UK. If I'd shown you the lines for other European countries, you would have seen something a little bit less dramatic following the Great Financial Crisis. The recovery would have been a little bit better, but actually still slow growth, essentially, since the GFC. And some of countries have recovered a bit better from the COVID pandemic. The US is one of the exceptions. I mean, if you look at the US economy, it has recovered much better from the Great Financial Crisis and indeed from the COVID pandemic. So, at the same time as we've had this challenge in terms of growth, we've also had a second shock which happened immediately after the pandemic in terms of our of inflation, which probably on a scale not seen in the advanced economies since the 1980s, especially in those countries like the UK, like the US, and in the Eurozone, where with monetary policy having been delegated to independent central banks since the early 1990s, mid to late 1990s, we'd seen kind of inflation disappear as being a persistent problem. But, since then we've had this major shock. It's what led to the so-called cost of living crisis in a number of countries, which has impacted, of course, in politics in the last 3-4 years. Indeed, many people have tried to correlate the cost of living crisis to government changes in government following elections. There's no doubt it had an impact on the US election, it had an impact in many European elections. So there's a bit of a debate, by the way, between economists as to what caused this inflationary surge. Economists do agree, of course, that the immediate cause of the inflationary surge was the supply chain dislocations in 2021 following the pandemic, which then, when the economies recovered, they butted up against these supply chain distortions. And subsequently, the Russian invasion of Ukraine put up raw material prices. So everybody's agreed as to what triggered the inflation. What there's less agreement with, in terms of, there's different schools of thoughts amongst economists, is that some think that actually it was just this shock and then wages went up, and that's something which Ben Bernanke and Olivier Blanchard have emphasized as being the main cause of inflation across these countries. Other economists are saying, well, it's not quite as simple as that. Probably central banks made some mistakes. They didn't put up interest rates fast enough in 2021 and late 2021, and as a result, there was also a demand pool effect of this inflation. Now, but whether you believe one or the other, there's no doubt that, about what actually triggered it. I gave a lecture in 2021, just about 2 or 3 months before the invasion of Ukraine, and you could begin to see this trend. And in fact, at the time, I inadvertently said if there were to be a war between Russia and Ukraine, then it would be inflation. So I'm not going to say anything tonight about what might happen in the future, just in case I trigger off some kind of event. Anyway, I personally think it would have been difficult for central banks to put up interest rates in late 2021. I think they would have come under terrible political pressure. So anyway, the point is, Trump 2.0 is coming on top, is overlaid on what is already a pretty difficult position in terms of macroeconomics across the globe. And a lot of pain that both households and corporations have gone through during that period. And already prior to the current trade protectionism trend that we're seeing under Trump 2.0, if you look at the forecasts which the World Bank and the IMF had produced towards the end of 2024, they were predicting a bit of a recovery from the interest rate hikes that we all saw in 22-23, but a bit of a recovery, but still relatively slow growth, especially in the advanced economies, and indeed some of the lower income economies. Before I move on to tell you a bit about the Trump 2.0 pronouncements, I wanted to just stress that protectionism is not a new phenomenon, okay? And I think this is important. I mean, economists know this, but we sometimes take it for granted because it's something we've lived with since 1947, or a move towards freer trade. But tariffs, and indeed, tariffs are not the only type of protection that government can impose on domestic industries. They can also subsidize domestic production. They can come up with quotas, which basically say you're not allowed to import more than X into the country. So we should realize that protectionism can take various forms. And actually, as we shall see, a lot of the protectionism, some of the retaliation, but also some of the measures by the US at the moment are not tariffs. They're actually to do with other forms of protection. And there are also a whole range of non-tariff barriers, which are really about regulations and other restrictions that can make trade much more difficult. So we should realize that it's not just about tariffs. Tariffs are basically a duty on imports, and that's what it is. It's simply a tax on imports, but it's not the only form of protectionism. It can take various measures. This is a bit of a timeline just from the web on actually the fact is just emphasizing the point that the period before we started liberalizing trade after 1947, after the GATT was established, was actually a period of a relatively short period. For most of the period of industrialization, and indeed post the period of initial industrialization, the world has had protectionism. And in the UK, that took the form of corn laws, protecting particularly imported foodstuffs, until those policies began to be abolished around the middle of the 19th century. The US had tariffs to protect its domestic industries throughout most of its industrial period. Indeed, many continental European countries had this period, what we're trying to protect their domestic industries. President Trump himself has actually drawn parallels between his own actions. His tariff is a beautiful word, which he uttered during the campaign, with President William McKinley's views. And you'll see on the timeline, in 1890, the McKinley Tariff Act was passed in the US. However, as Doug Irwin of the Peterson Institute for International Economics has pointed out, although in 1890, as an Ohio Congressman, McKinley did champion the Tariff Act, which raised average duties in the US from 38 to 49.5%, the similarities between McKinley and Trump probably end there. Yes, McKinley, like many of the Republicans of his era, favored protection of US industry, but they also favored reciprocal trade agreements, And actually, he might have been able to pursue that had he not been assassinated in 1901. And one other major difference between McKinley and Trump, by the way, is that he favored immigration aimed at growing US citizenship. So there are some differences in case you want to take that analogy too far. But the key point, as I say, is that the trend towards free trade is a relatively recent one. The other point I would like to make, which I apologize for the economists in the room because you know all this, but But if you take a very simple economic model, such as the one that we normally teach in second or third year undergraduate study, there is an argument can be made for tariffs. An argument can be made to protect your domestic industries. For a small country, the argument is difficult to make, actually. For a small country, you can generally prove in a very simple model that if you put up a tariff, your consumers are worse off, and actually you can't make that up simply through the revenue that you get through that tariff. So it doesn't work for small countries, but for large countries, it can work. You can actually make some benefit from putting up tariffs. Incidentally, you might say, well, small developing countries put up tariffs. In their case, it's more about getting revenue because they find it difficult to tax. And so for them, tariffs for small developing countries, often you see tariffs in play, not because they're trying to protect domestic industries, not a very good way of doing that, but essentially because it's a good way to raise money. In a large country, like the US, there is a potential gain to producers at a loss to consumers, essentially because what a large country can do, if it's big enough, by putting up tariffs, is can lower the price of the world price of the goods it's importing. So it can turn the terms of trade towards itself. It can gain in terms of trade. And you basically have to balance these two effects, the consumer loss against those terms of trade. And indeed, in this very simplified undergraduate economics international trade model, it can be shown that for a large country, there's an optimal tariff that you can calculate. You can say, well, and it depends on the export supply elasticity, for those of you who are interested in any of this stuff, and it's different for different goods. You know, it would be different for steel than it would be for a manufactured good. So you can make a case. So there might be a logic around protecting strategic industries. However, and this is a key point, which we'll return to many times, if both the large country increases tariffs and everybody else does the same thing, then I'm afraid that benefit disappears. So the benefit from tariffs for a large country only holds if nobody retaliates. And it follows, therefore, that tariff, being the most beautiful word in the English language, is only valid if it's not reciprocated. Indeed, I'll leave you with an economist's jocular maxim that love is great when it's reciprocated, tariffs only when they're not reciprocated. So you can take that away tonight. Of course, even the initial moves towards protectionism by President Trump in 2016, Trump 1.0, did not come out of the blue. And I think this is another key point. We sometimes identify protectionism as only associated with the first Trump presidency. In fact, it wasn't just about the United States. There were retaliations, but also there were other protectionist movements elsewhere. So this data comes from a website called Global Trade Alerts. It's actually quite an interesting website. You can actually find out, it kind of compiles a list of all the measures that every country takes in terms of which can be either harmful in the sense they're more protectionist, or they can be liberalizing. And as you can see, really, since 2016, it's been one-way traffic. But actually, even before 2016, there was an increase in protectionism across the globe. And the other important point is that the Biden presidency did nothing to reverse that trend. You know, yes, it's slackened off a bit after 2020, but the world has become much more protectionist in a sense. So it's not just a Trumpian move, it's much more general. In a sense, since the great financial crisis, we have seen a tendency to protect domestic industry through tariffs, but also through non-tariff barriers, and more recently through other measures like industrial policy favoring domestic industry. So, as you know, one of the major Biden presidency moves was to try and, through the Inflation Reduction Act, was to try and protect or favor domestic industries through subsidies as well. Pandemic has also played a part because the COVID pandemic, I think, showed just how difficult it is to manage complex supply chains around the world, and the resilience of those complex supply chains when something happens like a pandemic or a war, which prevents you from sourcing from your usual sources. And so you've heard expressions such as nearshoring or friendshoring, making sure that your supply chains don't go through countries that might turn out to be your enemy or that are closer to home so that you're not subject to the kind of problems that you have. So again, important to remember that these tariffs, this protectionism isn't just around Trump 1.0. But let me just quickly run through some of the points about what happened during Trump 1.0. It's worth saying, as I said, that Trump 1.0 is nothing on the scale of what we're seeing now in Trump 2.0. So if you try to compare the two, Trump 2.0, as we shall see, is a much more significant move towards protectionism. Trump 1.0 essentially involved two separate additional tariffs, 25% on goods from China and 25% on steel and 10% on aluminium products from all trading partners except Canada and Mexico, which are, of course, big trading partners for the US. And the interesting aspect of these tariffs, the Trump 1.0 tariffs, is threefold. First, the large country effect, which I mentioned earlier, which presumably they were designed to achieve, didn't happen. There's a very good paper published by Harvard Business School in 2023 by Laura Alfaro and Damon Shore, and then a paper in the Journal of International Economics in 2024 by Caroline Freund and a number of other co-authors. And they basically found that the US tariffs on China merely caused the reshaping of global supply chains. So that's the first point. It didn't actually lead to the benefit to the US economy that everybody expected. Direct trade flows from China to the US did fall back, but the trade supply chains were simply diverted through third countries. For instance, in a key sector like electronics, if you plot it, you see that direct exports from China to the US in electronics absolutely did fall. But essentially, the US started importing these products through Vietnam, through Indonesia, through Mexico and Canada, and through many other third countries. So trade was really being reallocated through third countries, and the cost of tariffs was being borne entirely by US consumers and producers. And this is really an important lesson about tariffs. When tariffs were the norm in the 19th century, the world was trading in finished goods. You know, we would import a manufactured good from some other country, or clearly also primary goods as well. But that's not how manufacturing works in the 21st century. Essentially, things are manufactured partially in different countries and goods move around, often crossing borders, the same border, more than once. And so our trade at the moment is not in final fully produced goods. Modern supply chains are about intermediate goods. And I think that's something which basic trade theory doesn't take into account. The second point here is that the impact of the steel and aluminium tariffs were different. Canadian and Mexican producers who were exempted couldn't offset the hike of prices, couldn't offset the tariff impact on production in the rest of the world. And there's a really good piece in the American Economic Review by Mary Amity and co-authors, which show that US import prices for steel did fall, and US producers were able to increase their production, so you got this big country effect that that we teach our second and third year students. But actually, you know, and although therefore there was a benefit to US producers and a disbenefit to foreign producers, these sectoral effects were important. They probably were wiped out after a while, partly because after a while, US producers exporting products made out of steel and aluminium were hit. So their import prices went up, and as a result, they ended up with no net benefit. The third point, and I think this is really important, is that the politics and economics of tariffs can diverge. And this is obviously why it's working, because you would otherwise say, why is it rational for Trump to do this if he's seen that it doesn't work in 2016? Well, the reason is perhaps because the politics and economics is different. There's a really good NBER paper, which has been published recently by David Autor and some of his co-authors. And they basically found that US tariffs on foreign goods didn't really help raise employment in protected sectors, so it didn't work. And with retaliatory measures from China and other countries, they negatively impacted on US employment, so it had a negative effect. However, the authors found, and I'm going to quote what they say because I think it's really interesting, consistent with expressive views of politics, the tariff war appears nevertheless to have been a political success for the governing Republican Party. Residents of regions more exposed to import tariffs became less likely to identify as Democrats, more likely to vote to re-elect Donald Trump in 2020, and more likely to elect Republicans to Congress. Foreign retaliatory tariffs only modestly weakened that support. So this is perhaps, and actually Graham Roy and I wrote a piece recently about zero-sum politics and zero-sum economics. This is the problem. It's affecting different people. And obviously, you still think you can get a positive political effect from tariffs. And I suspect this is what the Trump play is. I want to talk briefly about the whole global system of trade now before I return to Trump 2.0. And of course, as I said a moment ago, one of the interesting things is that it's become more adaptable. Following the Trump 1.0 tariffs, you got a reshaping of world trade. Chinese exports to the US were channeled through other countries. So you might say, well, maybe we shouldn't worry too much. However, it could be potentially dangerous if this fragmentation were to continue. The escalation of protectionism, and you saw that trend I put up from global trade alerts post-2016, meant that economists started doing some work on saying, well, how bad could this get? If this were to continue and the world were to really fragment into different trade blocs, how bad could it get? And the danger is that tariffs and other protectionist measures could end up pushing us towards a world that has two completely separate trade blocs. And we saw that, of course, during the Cold War, but it was different during the Cold War because we didn't integrate. The Iron Curtain went up pretty quickly, so we didn't integrate. We never integrated until the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended. And there's a good analysis by Schicken, Ayar, Anna Elena, and a number of colleagues at the International Monetary Fund, which was probably the first study to use this expression, geoeconomic fragmentation. And what they tried to do with this study, which published, it was actually a collection of essays which published a number of different contributions to this debate, was to see what would happen if the world were to completely separate into separate blocks. Much has happened during the early period of the Cold War. And I'm going to show you some of the estimates that they came up with because I think they are interesting. But before doing that, let me show you this chart from the IMF World Economic Outlook. This is from last October. They are tells you what total trade has been doing as a percentage of global GDP and gives you an idea that exactly as I showed earlier, something happened around the global financial crisis, and it's been cycling up and down, and you have the COVID effect and then a recovery since COVID. Hasn't grown world trade as a percentage of GDP, but it's kind of bobbing around at that level. One of the interesting things is that if you just make a hypothesis that there might be two imaginary blocks, one based around the West, around the US, Europe, and allied countries, and one based around Russia, China, and their closest trading countries, you see that actually even in the period, between 2022 to 24, compared to 2017 to 22, even in the last 2 years, there's less trade between blocks than within blocks. So something is happening. It's beginning to fragment, even without, a complete fragmentation into blocks. So the question, I suppose, which a number of these authors asked in this study, this collection of essays by the IMF colleagues, Ayar and Elena, is to say, well, can we calculate what might happen if the world splits into two blocks? So that's the hypothetical question they ask. This is a complex chart. I'm not going to go through it in detail. You can have a look at it in due course. It's actually measuring different things. Different studies measure different things. So the ones on the two on the left measure the estimate of global GDP losses. They basically say, well, how much would global GDP go down by if you had this breaking up of the world economy? The ones on the right are actually looking at estimates of individual countries and looking at ranges of losses. They're also not strictly comparable. They're different. They're using different models. And again, don't want to bore you because this is a public lecture. This is an economics lecture. They use different models. The IMF study uses their global integrated monetary and fiscal model, which is a conventional macroeconomic model. The WTO study with the Goes and Becker one, tends to use their Global Trade Analysis Project, which is a gravity model that economists call. It's not a big macro model. So they're not strictly comparable. And the ones on, they're looking also at different types of fragmentation. Some of them are saying, well, supposing we break into two blocks. Others are saying, well, supposing there's other effects. Not only do we not trade with each other, but there's no technology transfer. And the reason for economists why technology transfer matters in our models is that the assumption is that through trade, we absorb technology as well. That helps growth, and it helps transmit growth to the world economy. And all you need to know from this chart is that if you start allowing technological decoupling as well as trade decoupling, then actually some countries could be as worse off as 8 to 12%. You know, these are big, big shocks. But even if you don't assume that, even if you assume that it's really about trade or limited to electronics or limited to some strategic decoupling, it could still be a sizable shock to the world economy. And I'm going to take a deeper dive in one of the, so of these studies, this one's the second from the left. I'm going to give you just a little bit more detail on it just to show you how these things work. So this is, so the 4 studies that I showed in the earlier slide, this is a deeper dive into one which was by Marijn Bolhuis at the IMF and his 2 co-authors, Jiaqin Chen and Benjamin Kett. And they're looking at, first of all, they look at a benign scenario, the blue bars. And essentially what they're assuming in this benign scenario is that all that happens is that the US and the EU eliminate all trade between Russia, with Russia, as well as the elimination of all high-tech sectors between China and the US and the European Union. So let's assume there's no trade on high-tech between China and the US and its allies, and all goods between Russia and the West. And these are the kind of shocks you get. Now, strategic decoupling doesn't lead to major economic shocks. Some countries still benefit, by the way. Low-income countries actually benefit a bit because essentially they are able to take up the place in areas like primary commodities from Russia being decoupled, for instance. However, if you take a more serious scenario, which is the world has to fragment into 2 trade blocks, and how do they do this? They basically say, well, let's look who third countries now trade with, so non-aligned countries, Indonesia, South Africa, whatever. They say, well, who do they trade most with the West or with Russia, China? And then they just allocate them to different blocks, and they say what then happens to the world economy through that model. And as you can see, the shocks there can be pretty dramatic. You know, these are permanent losses to GDP, 2% for the advanced economies, over nearly 2.5% for emerging markets. For low-income economies, a 4% loss. I mean, low-income economies are particularly hit because trade is so important for them. So this is the kind of permanent GDP loss that you would get if the world were to fragment into that. Now, you're going to tell me the world isn't going to fragment into 2 blocks. I mean, what's been happening in the US over the last few weeks certainly doesn't suggest to you that the West is a coherent bloc. And of course, you'd be right. And that's not what the US administration is doing at the moment. And I'm going to come back to this at the end. But for the moment, what I would like to do is just draw some general conclusions from these trade and macroeconomic models before I move to Trump 2.0. First, the deeper the fragmentation, whether it's only in trade and goods, or whether it's also technology transfer and other potential interactions, it's really bad for the world economy if it's, the deeper that fragmentation is. And you can see some of these figures, and these are not as big as the total technological decoupling that I showed you on the previous slide. Second, if you do look at technology transfer and technological decoupling, this is really bad news, particularly for countries that are technology hubs at the interface of major economies. So the dynamic effects of trade losses are really severe. If you look at Singapore, for instance, or you look at some of the dynamic Asian economies that are technology hubs, those previous slides, the one on the right, that's really, really bad news for them. So that's what needs to be remembered. And the third problem is that most of these models are modeling trade ending events. So this is about trade ending. This is not about tariffs. And I'm going to show you about tariffs, how important tariffs are in a moment. And the fourth problem, the fourth point I wanted to make is that there is a problem, a caveat with all these studies, is that, as I said, it's modeling a two-block world. Well, what if the world fragmented into three blocks? The United States, the European Union, Russia, China, and connected countries. Well, I don't think it requires an economist to say that these bars would be bigger, actually, because the more, there is a general there's a general picture from these that the worse the fragmentation, the more barriers you put in, the worse it gets. So it doesn't get any better by making it multipolar. So let's move to the present. Now, I want to tell you a bit about tariffs. What I'd like to do now is just to illustrate what kind of economic impact the Trump 2.0 tariffs might cause. The difficulty in evaluating the impact is that there's been such a raft of announcements on tariffs, both during the US election campaign and more importantly since inauguration, that it's actually quite difficult to keep track. There is actually there's a website there that if you're interested, it's actually quite good. It keeps track not only of actual tariff announcements, it also tells you what stage they're at. It also tells you what's been threatened so far in case any of these threats actually come true. So it's not a bad website. I've checked a few, and this one has actually got quite a lot of the announcements. It tells you also whether they'll be backed by executive orders or by memorandum to the U.S. Department of Commerce or the U.S. Trade Envoy. So it's actually quite a good website. So very briefly, on February 1st, of course, we had the first announcement. President Trump announced that he would impose 25% tariffs on most imports from Canada and Mexico, except imports of Canadian energy, which faced a lower 10% tariff, and an additional 10% tariff on imports in China. So that was his first announcement. China retaliated. Canada and Mexico were suspended following discussions with the relative heads of government in the two countries. They put up a pause for about to see whether they would work a deal. China's retaliation was rather more moderate. It wasn't quite as extensive as the US. China was much more moderate in its retaliation. They put up 15% tariffs on US coal and liquefied natural gas, 10% on US crude oil, farm equipment and other US goods. It also opened an antitrust investigation into Google, again showing you that this is not just about tariffs. Just jumping to the other side, of course today was the deadline for the suspension of the Canada and Mexico ones. And in fact, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to update the chart, it only happened today. So the White House actually has said that it is going to go ahead with the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and it's also put an additional 10% on China on top of the 10% that it put up in February. China has now retaliated further today with a 10 to 15% tariff on US agricultural goods, including beef, corn, soybeans, and wheat from next week. Canada has imposed 25% tariffs. It's going to do it in two phases. Mexico has said that it will announce its retaliation over the weekend. China has also done some other non-tariff restrictions. It's banned the biotech company Illumina, which does genetic sequencing, from exporting to China. It's imposed export controls on 15 US companies and blacklisted 10 others. Now, I would argue that China's response is actually still moderate, as it only affects 25% of the imports of the US. So it's not quite as extensive as what has happened today from the US. Moving back now to the second staging post in February the 10th, President Trump reinstated the 25% tariffs on global steel imports and raised tariffs on global aluminium imports from 10% to 25% from the 12th of March. And these duties are in addition to any anti-dumping or countervailing duties on products of China, that China and other applicable duties that may apply. So a big further announcement. And the February proclamations terminate any prior arrangements, because one thing that happened during Trump 1.0 around steel and aluminium is that it then offsets some of that with some other countries like Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Japan, Mexico, South Korea, the EU, and the UK. Now, it's still not entirely clear what it's doing across all of these countries, but they basically got rid of all of that around steel and aluminium. I want to focus particularly on the 13th of February because that's when the word reciprocal tariffs came into play. And as we'll see in a moment, reciprocal tariffs are particularly insidious because I think they drive at the base of free trade arrangements since 1947. The President issued a memorandum to the Secretary of Commerce and the US trade representatives to, and I quote, initiate all necessary actions to investigate the harm to the US from any non-reciprocal trade arrangements adopted by any trading partners. That's pretty generic. Now, a key underpinning of the GATT and WTO rules, this is the key clause in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It's the first article. It's the so-called Most Favored Nation, or MFN, approach. It requires countries to treat all trading partners equally, except where there's a trade agreement in place. So in the EU, there's a trade agreement in place, so we can be more favorable towards EU countries, those of us who are in the EU. Those who are citizens of EU countries will know that between the EU, we're part of a single market, so there are clearly no tariff barriers there. But even general trade agreements such as the Pan-Pacific Partnership and others, they lower tariffs. You're allowed to do that, but if you don't have a trade agreement in place, you can't just say, well, I'll have one tariff for you and one tariff for you and one tariff for you. There is the key Article 1 of the GATT says you've got to treat everybody the same. And that is clearly the reciprocal tariffs, which are basically saying, well, it depends on what you charge me, is completely in violation of that. The other thing which is absolutely remarkable about this announcement on the 13th of February is that the administration said that it would also take into account, when calculating reciprocal tariffs, taxes on goods such as value-added taxes. Now, value-added taxes are not a trade instrument. We pay VAT in the UK on goods that are produced in the UK as much as goods that are produced in the US. It's not a trade discriminatory measure. So to say that you're going to take VAT into account is really quite remarkable because it is basically taking this into a totally new territory. So it really is quite dramatic. And based on comments from the incoming Secretary of Commerce, any reciprocal tariffs may come into play as early as April the 2nd. So, it's happening quite soon if it's going to happen. And the White House released examples of unfair trade. The US tariff on ethanol is 2.5%, but Brazil charges US ethanol exports a tariff of 18%, and so on and so forth. The EU imposes a tariff of 10% on US cars. The US tariff is 2.5%. So you can see that what it's heading on that. And then I don't want to emphasize this too much, but then there are some sectoral tariffs. And then on the 18th of February, it announced some sectoral tariffs on automobiles, on medicine, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors. On the 21st of February, there was actually another interesting announcement which veered into other areas of policy. The White House sent a memorandum to the Secretaries of Treasury and Commerce and the US Trade Representative on the subject of defending American companies and innovators from overseas extortion and unfair fines and penalties. And in essence, what it's looking for is public comments, which the Commerce and Treasury will seek, public comments on unfair trade practices by individual countries, specifically looking at digital service taxes, which some EU countries like Spain and Austria and France have introduced. Some countries like the UK charge digital service taxes. It's very low level, but we charge them. Turkey and Canada. The EU has a digital levy, but it hasn't imposed it at the moment. So this is what this is attacking. And so on and so forth. On the 25th and 26th of February, we saw the Secretary of Commerce being asked to investigate imports of copper. And on February 26th, during a cabinet meeting, this isn't an actual memorandum or an executive order, the President said that tariffs on the EU would be announced soon because the EU was set up to screw the United States. I think that's the words he used. And so that gives you a feeling for where we're going. So now, what I would like to do now is just to give you an idea of how some of these tariffs may play out, because I've given you some of these fragmentation scenarios, but they don't tell you anything about tariffs. they tell you about what happens if the world breaks into two blocks. This will give you an idea of the magnitude of the effects from some of these tariffs. And I'm going to use two models which focus largely on the first one focuses pretty much exclusively on Canada and Mexico. It's actually a very good study by the Peterson Institute of International Economics. Warwick McKibben and his co-authors used the model that Warwick has developed with Wilcoxon and others, which is essentially a computable general equilibrium model, which will mean nothing to the non-economist, but to the economist will mean a lot. And it basically allows you to model the dynamic effect of this. Now, you have to assume in the model, you have to say, well, what happens if the US imposes these tariffs? And then you say, well, supposing others retaliate, will that make it worse? Well, of course it will make it worse. As I said earlier, retaliation is bad because it's negative sum. So this is what happens to GDP in the US and Canada and Mexico, according to Warwick McKibben and his co-authors, if there were these tariffs which now have been imposed, go ahead. And basically you see some pretty big losses, less for the US to be fair. The US suffers less, but it's still a negative effect on GDP. Canada by 2028 loses about 1.2% of GDP relative to baseline. For Mexico, it's a slower burn, but it goes down to about 2%, and that's without retaliation. They have to retaliate because otherwise, goodness knows where this goes, and if they retaliate, actually it's bad for the countries who are retaliating as well. It's genuinely a really bad outcome. For Mexico, by 2030, you're losing over 3% of GDP relative to baseline. For the US, it's a loss of about 1.2%. The other thing this does is to raise inflation, because it raises prices, of course, for consumers. And for the US, this builds in about, even without retaliation, about 0.5% in GDP, in inflation by 2025. And with retaliation, of course, for the US, it's nearly 1%. But for Canada and Mexico, it's pretty big news. It's 4% to inflation in Mexico with retaliation, and for Canada, about 3%. So you can see how damaging this is in macroeconomic effects. There is another model which I've found, which looks at some of this stuff. This is by Fitch Ratings. I'm actually grateful to my brother, Alex Muscatelli. Never thought I would use anything that my brother would do in economics, but there you are. There's a first for everything. But no, I'm very grateful to Alex for sharing these simulations. They're publicly available. Actually, they're on LinkedIn if you want to find them. And basically, what they've done, and I say it's more nuanced than the previous model, and that's why I wanted to show it. What they've done is in their December global forecast, in the Fitch Ratings December global forecast, they actually tried to model effective tariff rates. Now, one of the problems in pulling a lever on an economic model to see what tariffs do is that the tariffs don't fall on every good. And as I said earlier, in fact, some countries, when they put up tariffs, like China recently in retaliation, it doesn't just say, well, we're going to charge tariffs on everything that we import from the US. It's selective. So the effective tariff rate tries to calculate how much are tariffs actually going up, given that a lot of goods are not subject to tariffs, even with those once tariffs are imposed. So they try to calculate something called the effective tariff rate. And effectively, this chart tells you what the assumptions are behind the global forecast, the global economic outlook, which Fitch Ratings did back in late 2024. And they were basically assuming that China was going to be the biggest, was going to suffer the biggest shock, and everything else was going to go up a bit in terms of the effective tariff. They then, what they did was to do a simulation. Well, before I come to that, if they did this, which was what they assumed, it would actually potentially generate an additional $180 billion for the US in duties, assuming unchanged import volumes, equivalent to about 1% of US consumption. Now, the reason I wanted to mention this is because part of the reason for this, for having tariffs, is that you could also use these tariffs to cut taxes in the US. And I want to come back to this because this may be part of the Trump 2.0 play. But essentially, this is the tariff play. And what they then did a few weeks ago is that once they saw the Canada-Mexico effect, they then said, okay, let's suppose there is that 25% effective tariff on all goods, not just dutiable, applied to Mexico, applied to Canada, except for energy imports at 10%, as I said, and they've left the China assumptions unchanged. I find this quite a dramatic chart because it tells you that the effects, they're a bit bigger because it's 2026 that this chart refers to. They're bigger than the assumption, than the modeling results from the McKibben paper. So if this is a closer picture to what really might happen, it really is quite dramatic for Canada and Mexico. It's bigger than what we saw in the earlier chart. But you can see that the effect also spreads to other countries as well, because they are all connected. You know, Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan, these are all countries that are connected through trade flows. So it could be really quite dramatic. So let me just check what the time is. I need to try and conclude quickly. We've seen what that initial Trump 2.0 play is, and who knows where it might go next. So the big question is what happens next, and what other major economies, what might other major economies do to offset or counter these moves? I don't have a crystal ball, and thank goodness for that. I'm not going to predict any more wars, as I did in 2021. I should say at the outset that some of this may not be about trade policy at all. And initially, I wondered whether it would be about trade policy, because some of the justification behind the initial Canada and Mexico and China tariff hike at the beginning of February was about it mentioned immigration from Mexico, it mentioned fentanyl production, and one thought, well, is this about something else? Is this using tariffs as not to execute trade policy, but as a bargaining chip to try and extract other concessions? But actually, I now think it's really about trade policy, because the fact that the Canada and Mexico tariffs have been confirmed today, it's at least in part about trade policy. Because some of this projection of power is more reminiscent of a 19th century imperial era than it is about the kind of trade that we have now. It's not the kind of trade policy we normally see. But I don't think it's purely transactional. I think some of this is real. A related question is whether the US might regret some of its protectionist moves. Some of you may have seen today that following the confirmation of the Canada and Mexico tariffs, that US stock markets have slumped again. They've gone back down to pre-electoral levels. Standard & Poor 500 index is back to where it was before the election. And of course, as we see, there is an economic damage that will be done to the US, although less than some of its trading partners. So it could be that some of this might be regretted, but I have to say that I do wonder, because of what I said earlier about the divergence of politics and economics. And of course, as I said earlier, even if it's about creating policy, the one thing that might not help the US is that if this creates such uncertainty, because Trump 2.0 is on a different scale from Trump 1.0 on tariffs, it's going to create so much uncertainty for US companies that it might really depress investment in the US. Now, this is the one area where I think it might play differently for them this time in terms of, and why the administration might regret the self-harm. Now, and actually there is a study, I'll mention it in passing, there was a study in 2018 in the Journal of Monetary Economics which suggested that even with 2016, US business investment probably fell by 1.5% because of the uncertainty caused by tariffs. A more important question, however, that I think than the conjunctural macroeconomic issue is what might the best move be for other countries or country blocs? Most economics observers have suggested that actually the best thing for other countries to do is to deepen other trade relationships. And we've seen that in the EU. The EU has negotiated a trade deal with Mercosur, South America, the bloc of 4 countries in South America. It's negotiating a deal with Mexico. It's in the process of accelerating a deal potentially with India. In fact, following the Trump tariff announcements, you saw von der Leyen going to visit Prime Minister Modi, and they're negotiating speeding up of that particular deal. Now, the UK is in an interesting position because, of course, it wants to reset its relationship and deepen the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU. But on the other hand, It's also, actually, its relationship with the US and purely trade is actually okay because most of our exports to the US are services, not goods. And they're less subject to barriers. We don't run a trade surplus relative to the US. And the worry is that if we get too close to the EU, we might be punished by whatever might happen in terms of EU tariffs. So for the UK, there are trade-offs here, although if you get these kind of effects that I showed earlier, you need to offset them somehow by deepening your trade with other countries. I think an interesting question is if variable geometry is now the name of the game, in the sense that it's not these two blocks, and we're going to have blocks, as I say, perhaps around Europe, around the UK, around China, maybe other G20 countries, can they form common cause? Now, this gets very complicated very quickly, and I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail. I've deliberately not said much about how WTO trade disputes are handled, because A, they're complicated, and B, they don't work at the moment. Trade disputes are not resolved by the WTO because both the first Trump administration and indeed the Biden administration has refused to confirm the appointment of judges to the so-called WTO appellate body. So at the moment, any disputes are taking ages to work through. Incidentally, one of the things that China did when it retaliated in early February is to put in a complaint to the WTO. And that was an important signal because for China, they were saying they might not play by the rules, but we're going to play by the rules. So there's an interesting signal there, I think, from China. But one of the questions some observers, trade observers have asked is, if the US is moving effectively, if the US moves, particularly the one around MFN, around most favored nations, are going to destroy the WTO system if they get taken to the logical conclusion. Because if each country goes back to supposing the EU goes back to the US and says, no, please don't put tariffs on us, we'll negotiate some kind of deal on tariffs. The problem is that the US is taking the EU onto that terrain of breaking the first article of the GATT. So if we play ball with this, we actually are going to contribute to the destruction of the world trading system. The alternative, which some people have suggested, and I don't know whether this is viable because it's difficult, is that other countries, which have all been impacted by the US moves, could get together and trigger Article 28 of the GATT, the WTO, and actually begin a tariff round and say, you know what, you're putting tariffs on us, we're going to get together into a huddle here, and you're welcome to join, nobody's excluding you, you're welcome to join, we're going to negotiate some tariffs, a new tariff schedule, which they could do. They could set a limit of 6 months to make that negotiation. They could try and drive tariffs down across the rest of the system, and that would put greater pressure on the US. Now, would that happen? It's difficult, given the geopolitics involved, because it involves countries that are potentially geopolitical rivals. But it's not impossible that if the US continues like this, that the others could counter some of those moves. So this is an interesting possibility. The other thing which countries like the EU might do, or blocs like the EU might do, the EU passed an instrument in 2023 called the Anti-Coercion Instrument, which allows it much greater action outside the WTO to really take retaliatory action, including banning certain US companies. In fact, one of the articles actually allows them to take action against individuals connected to hostile governments. So who knows where that might go, or the companies that they run. So you can work out the rest yourself. Anyway, look, let me conclude. I've probably confused you more than enlightened you tonight. I've given you more questions than answers. But if I had to summarize this briefly in 4 points, Trump 1.0 saw the advent of a much more protectionist era in the global economy, combined with the Russia-Ukraine war and the declared US-China strategic rivalry. It really set the scene for potentially geoeconomic fragmentation. And I've illustrated to you where that could have gone. Trump 2.0 presents a much more confusing picture at the moment because we don't know whether in this scattergun series of announcements which will stick and which will be withdrawn, how the rest of the world will retaliate, whether it will be through WTO processes or not. But I would say this, that if this leads to the breakup of the WTO system, essentially this takes us into that kind of geoeconomic fragmentation. Third, if this is really a brave new world in terms of trade, an apparent fracture in US-European economic relations will require European countries, and that includes the UK, not only the EU, to operate in a multipolar economic world. Now, this is a world which does have to involve the other G20, not just the US. And finally, fourth, a trade policy shock does make life much more complicated for governments and for central banks. I haven't go back to macroeconomics, but last week, Swati Dhingra, who's one of the external members of the MPC, gave a lecture at the National Institute in which she said, well, what does trade fragmentation do for central banks and for governments trying to stabilize their economy? And basically, she made the obvious point, but an important point, and she quantified that if we're having these supply shocks, it makes life really difficult for central banks. It's going to put the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, into a really difficult territory of having shocks that are increasing inflation and then trying to predict how much of that will feed through to wages. So, this could make life really, really difficult. And I'm going to quote a bit from our lecture because it's actually really interesting. It says, over the past 15 years, at least 50% of variations of UK GDP growth are estimated to have been driven by global shocks rather than purely domestic factors. So this does matter for our macroeconomic policy. And I haven't told you anything tonight about financial geoeconomic fragmentation, which might also happen if we get trade fragmentation. But perhaps we can leave that for the questions, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it is left for us just to thank you very much for a global take on an interesting global situation. I suppose we could leave it at that. And to thank everyone. I'll just put in a plug for the 17th of March. We have Professor Qasim Qassam from Warwick University, who will be coming to deliver the Dudley Knowles Lecture in Political Philosophy. I think there's going to be a slide. There we go. So can we please thank Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli for a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.